Hey guys, how you doing? It's James back with another review. Hey, we're doing another review. I read so many books in May. More books than I've read in any month of the entire year, but that's irrelevant because today we're doing a review of The Poppy War by R.F.Kuang. This is a book, it's a fantasy book set in a sort of fantasticalized China. It's not actually set in China. It's setting what is known as the Nikaran Empire, and it follows a young war orphan named Runin, or Rin, as she becomes known, as she joins a prestigious military academy, and then is thrust into the heart of a very violent war against their neighbouring country, the Federation of Mugen, which is like an approximation for Japan. The book is inspired by events that happened in the 1930s as the First and Second Sino-Japanese War, where a lot of real-life atrocities happened, and there's some shades of World War II in here as well. It sort of draws on that whole period of history, but the setting is more fantastical, so it sort of still has people fighting with swords and stuff. So I'm going to put this down because it's heavy, but look at the cover, isn't it lovely? Right, The Poppy War. What did I think? It's a book of two halves. It's split into three parts, which follow Rin's progression from joining the Academy of Sinigard all the way through to sort of becoming involved in this war. But functionally, it really has two main parts. The first part being her time at the Academy and sort of joining the Academy and her time there, and the second part being her time in the war effort. The reason I make this distinction is that the style in these two parts is so very different, and for a very long time I was really disappointed by this book, but at the end I completely changed my mind. So let that be a lesson to you, to never really pass final judgment on something before you've actually finished it, because it could just blow your mind towards the end. You never know. So what was going on then in the first part of the book? So the setup is that Rin is a war orphan who's been adopted by these opium smugglers, and they're planning to sell her off in a sort of political marriage to this guy who just like controls drug importation in this one area. So they're trying to get, able to do their drug dealing more better. They're trying to do better drug deals, so they're going to marry Rin off to this guy. Rin is not fond of the idea because he's like some weird old dude, and to counteract this, she decides to pass an impossible to pass test called the Keiju. So basically it's like a test. It's essentially like doing your 11 plus. If you English, you would know what that is. It's back in the olden days of the 70s. They had this thing called the 11 plus, where when you were 11, you did this pretty hard test, and if you passed it, you got to go to like a good school, and if you didn't pass it, you went to a shit school. It's been abolished now in England, apart from in Kent, because Kent is weird, so Kent just does that still. But that's what it felt like, because as much as Kuang wanted to sort of insinuate to us that it was like this really impossible test, we never really saw that. We were told that Rin studied for 2 years to pass this test, and it was really hard. But like, this is the inciting incident of the book, so it's not really a spoiler. This all happens within the first 20 pages, and that was really sort of my first issue with the part one of the book, is that it was so rushed. Lots of things were brushed over. We skip huge chunks of time in like 1 or 2 sentences, and that really annoyed me because, like, we want to see what's happening, but then like you'll go into all this detail about something, and then it'll go, oh, and then like 2 years later, and it's like, oh, okay, so nothing happened for two whole years, okay. So yeah, the basically what this ended up with being was things that were told to us to be really impossible actually seem pretty easy and straightforward. So Rin passes this exam, and she can't just pass it normally. You know, she has to do super well to get into the prestigious military academy of Sinagard, which is in the capital city. The reason for that is because all the other ones require a tuition fee, and she's like an orphan. So she gets a free ride basically by going to what is essentially Fantasy West Point. The second problem that I had with the first part of the book comes in here. Because Kuang rushed through a lot of the setup to sort of joining the academy and things, and it sort of gets right into this school situation. We don't get a lot of flavour of the world straight away, so it also sort of feels kind of westernized. This doesn't help that obviously R.F.Kuang is 21 years old and lives in America. And as a result, she writes all of her characters like they are 21 years old and live in America. Because they all, like, the speech patterns in the dialogue are very westernized. All the phrasing is quite modern. So you don't get a feel from the writing what the world is like. And because the author decided to rush through quite a lot of stuff in the setup, we don't get a good idea of what this world is supposed to be like, and that's a problem that carries through pretty much the whole book. Like, it took me a long time to understand that they were fighting with like medieval weaponry, because everything I'd heard about the book implied that it was based on events from like the 1930s, and it's really ambiguously described, or sometimes not described at all, what things are like. So people would simultaneously wear like uniforms, like military uniforms, but also would fight with swords and axes. And she describes like an armored column, like going across the land, and is that like, what is it, a tank? What is an armored column of what? It's not discussed. So you know, you don't get a lot of that. But it's probably one of the biggest flaws with R.F. Kuang's writing, is that there's just a lack of descriptions throughout. And what happens in the first section is we fall into so many tropes that are rampant in YA literature that really had me worried, like I'd been bamboozled into reading a YA fantasy book by accident. Because everything I'd heard about this was like, oh my god, this is like the most brutal book I've ever read. It's like just disturbing and emotional and very adult. And I was like, oh shit, like that sounds cool. And then while I was reading this, I remembered I heard very similar things about Angel Fall by Susan E., which was like fucking terrible as a book. So I was really concerned that this was going to happen. It uses the phrase, and I quote, "She let out a breath she didn't realise she had been holding," and that's the death blow to a lot of YA shit. It's very typical. So we get all these things like, you know, she's from a mysterious background, she excels at stuff, she goes to this school, this prestigious school, she has a best friend, none of the other kids like her, like they've got snobby rich kids, all of this stuff. There's a mysterious bad boy who's super good at everything, and like for 250 pages I was really fucking worried that this was just going to be a YA fantasy piece of nonsense. And then halfway through, just everything completely fucking changed, and I was like, what's happened here? Suddenly, when the war starts in the book, you know, once the war starts and we get into that side of it, that's where all the stuff that you want to see comes in. You get the violence, the brutality, the emotional resonance, all of the characters that were so cliche and tropey before are suddenly developed into something way better. You know, all of these assumptions and preconceptions that you have about the early stages of the book and the way it's going, like, it definitely took me for a ride, because like I had some very fixed ideas about how I thought this was going to go based on the setup, and I was wrong. Basically, it changed it. It subverted these tropes that it set up in the first part. And whilst I really do appreciate that, I do feel that it's worth pointing out as a flaw that I think we didn't get enough hints early on that these tropes would be subverted. It played it too straight for a long time, so that I feel as you weren't aware that it had a switch up halfway through. People that wanted tropey stuff would get annoyed by the switch, and people that wanted like something different would get bored early on with all the tropey things. But that's why I'm here to tell you, you can safely just power through and you will be rewarded for your patience and your perseverance, because boy oh boy, does this have some content that needs to be warned about. There are war crimes, like heinous ones, not your fucking standard, oh, what have we become war crimes. More, holy shit, this is disgusting war crimes. And that's coming from me, and I'm very jaded. And there's, you know, lots of drug use, which is, you know, whatever. There's graphic rape things, all that stuff. That you'd need a content warning on these days. It's all in there, so if you're really faint of heart, don't read this. You don't, because it's gonna like fucking upset you. But if you don't mind that, go for it, because it's really good. Characters, as I say, that were all set up and seemed really cliche early on, really develop and turn into something much better. The only thing from the second half of the book that I would argue is not as strong is that there's this cast of characters that's introduced that are kind of like, they're tonally inconsistent with the rest of it, because they're all very flippant about what's going on. And as the war becomes more brutal, they sort of stay that way, and it kind of is a jarring disconnect with these guys that are like trying to crack jokes and goofs whilst all this like horrible shit is going on. Could have done without them, to be honest. I would have preferred it if the book just followed Rin, but we get like this squad of other guys. But yeah, so that's really all I can say on The Poppy War by R.F.Kuang. Really good. 4 stars. It loses a star because it really does struggle in the beginning, I think, to find its feet, and it might put some people off. But overall, very rewarding reading experience. Very dark. And next time we do a review, it's going to be of something that is a lot more traditional, light-hearted fantasy fun. I'll see you then. Take care. Bye.